Welcome to Bespoken Bones with your host, Pavini Moray, connecting ancestors, sex, magic and science. Pavini explores transpersonal tools for erotic wellness every new and full moon, engaging educators, healers, spiritual leaders and scientists in revolutionary dialogue. Get ready to feel good and go deep. This is Bespoken Bones.
Hi, and welcome to Bespoken Bones, Ancestors at the Crossroads of Sex, Magic, and Science. We're in the business of healing trauma, connecting with our roots, and developing radiant erotic wellness in past, present, and future generations. And I am your host, Pavini Moray, and this evening I am delighted to introduce you to Mallorie Vaudoise. And Mallorie is a Brooklyn-based spiritualist of Italian descent, and she studies Southern Italian music and dance with world-renowned folk artist Alessandro Belloni. And she believes that music, food, wine, and kissing are vital tools of spiritual evolution. And if you would like to find out more about Mallorie, which you probably are going to, you can check out her website at www.italianfolkmagic.com. And she also has a blog and a Facebook page, Italian Folk Magic. So Mallorie, welcome. So glad to have you.
Thank you for having me, Pavini. It's really an honor. I'm a huge fan of the show.
Oh, that's great. I really want to know about Italian folk magic, and if you would talk a little bit about that and introduce us to what it is and your work with it. And yeah.
Certainly. So Italian folk magic is my term for several interrelated traditions that are found native to Italy and certain Italian diasporic communities in other parts of the world. And these are very diverse traditions. Because as some of your listeners may be aware, the idea of Italy as a unified nation is only about 150 years old, and the idea of a pan-Italian ethnic identity is even younger than that. So these traditions really reflect the history of Italy and Sicily as being places where, there were many interrelated groups of people, each with their own language, their own culture, their own sets of beliefs that were nonetheless in conversation with one another. About 84% of Italian Americans, such as myself, are coming from southern Italy and Sicily. So I tend to focus on those particular areas because this project for me is really about being in service to my community and being a resource to people who have similar heritage, who have similar familial traditions, and who have gone through similar ancestral trauma. So the cultural influences that we're talking about here are the paganisms of ancient Greece and Rome, and also other cultures native to the region that you may be less familiar with, such as the Apulians, the Samnites, and the Etruscans. And of course also their trade partners in both North Africa and the Middle East who had an indelible influence on the cultures of the region. So Italian folk magic is vaguely Catholic, but at the same time, it's not quite as Jesus-centric as I think a lot of people are expecting. And instead of having this Jesus-centricity, which a lot of American Christians are familiar with and assume they'll find, Italian folk Catholicism and consequently Italian folk magic has very different prominent figures, and there's none that really rests at the center, but rather they're all in conversation with one another, very similar to how the different cultures have related to one another. So we have figures such as different Madonnas, who in the folk tradition are often described as being sisters as opposed to aspects of one person, the various saints, and also the dead. And it's that latter group that I think we'll probably be talking about the most tonight. But my unique work really incorporates traditional devotion to the Madonnas, the saints, and the dead, prayers and songs and other linguistic artifacts in the indigenous languages of the region. Those are sometimes, unfortunately, referred to as dialects, but they're more properly known as languages, and those include Neapolitan and Sicilian. as well as concepts from ancient paganisms and modern spiritism.
That's great. I'm excited to, I know you offered later to teach us a prayer, and I'm really excited to have that experience with you. And we're also going to talk a little bit more about your particular work and how you're offering that to folks towards the end of the podcast. Having recently celebrated Indigenous Peoples Day, formerly known as Columbus Day, just want to invite you to speak a little bit about Columbus. And you quoted, I want to quote you as saying he's totally inappropriate as an Italian American icon. Just if you'd speak a little bit about why.
Well, thank you so much for bringing this up, because I know that this is definitely an important issue, and I think it's an area where hopefully a bit of perspective can help. But as some people know, Columbus Day was originally instituted as a way to celebrate Italian American pride during a time when that pride was sorely needed, and when Italian immigrants arriving in the United States were finding just as much oppression and abuse as they had suffered in Italy. And today, the strongest opposition that we find to renaming the day and to removing statues of Columbus usually come from my fellow Italian Americans. And so I want to just make one thing clear right off the bat, which is that we should not be celebrating genocide, and that should really be the end of the debate. You know, it doesn't have to go further than that. And it actually makes me quite anxious, I guess, in a way, to see that we have to continue to discuss this. But nevertheless, there's some more that I think is important to bear in mind when we're talking about Columbus. And as you quoted, I do think that he's inappropriate as a representation of Italian American ethnic identity. So as I mentioned earlier, about 84% of Italian Americans are from the South. And Columbus was from Genoa, which is actually a lot closer to France and to Switzerland than it is to, say, Naples or Palermo in Sicily. And he lived several hundred years before unification. So he's really a figure who lived in a different place and spoke a different language and who sailed under a different flag than any of our ancestors knew. And so it just strikes me how absolutely wounded and alienated and disconnected we have to be to get to the point where we're willing to venerate that person instead of our own ancestors. And I'm not saying that it's abnormal in any way to adopt ancestors. I think that, you know, that is quite normal. But to replace your ancestral line with this particular face seems symptomatic to me of the trauma that we have experienced.
It's interesting to me because it really brings up the distinction, I guess, between the dead who are well in spirit and the dead who are not well in spirit. And I don't know if Christopher Columbus is well in spirit or not, but it just brings up of like, who do you want to invite in, right? Like, do you, in my opinion, the dead are not equally well, right? That just because you die doesn't mean that you necessarily become an ancestor, that's a process that you go through. And so because someone did things in their life that are remembered historically doesn't necessarily indicate that they are a ancestral resource that we could be drawing on. And in fact, because of his choices and his actions in life, right, that have created a wide swath of suffering in his wake, it's just a little bit, it's not a little bit, it's a lot of what are we choosing to lift up, and what does that mean? And it's yeah. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Oh, absolutely. I'm totally in agreement with you. And I think in a way, the idea of isolating one man to represent this particular, type of heritage is already a non-starter for me. And I hear this concern often voiced by my fellow Italian Americans, which is that if we take down Columbus, who are we going to replace him with? But ultimately, our strongest cultural values have always been things like family and community and stewardship of the earth. So why do we even need a statue of one man who's been isolated from his family and community and from Mother Earth to represent our heritage?
It's a great reframe on it. How did the Southern Europeans traditionally practice ancestral reverence?
So we find in southern Italy and Sicily a very strong tradition of dreaming and dreaming into contact with the dead. And so you find lots of dream dictionaries, some of them which will translate symbols into actual omens, others which will be used in order to translate them into lottery numbers that can be played. And this idea that the dead can reach us through our dreams reflects other folk beliefs about death and dying. There's this belief generally in a semi-physical soul or an astral body, which can leave the body after physical death, but which at that point has to journey into the other world. And this journey into the other world is generally regarded as something which is particularly arduous. And so the means by which we actually do that journey is over the Ponte di San Giacomo, which is, it translates as the Bridge of St. Jacob. And it's said to be covered in knives and pins and other sharp objects. And so it's a painful journey that we make in order to become purified and to reach the other world. But it's particularly risky that somebody won't make that journey if they die suddenly or violently, or if they leave behind some kind of unfinished business in this life, such as young children that are in need of them. And the risk there is that they will remain as revenants, and rather than becoming an elevated ancestor, as you referred to earlier, that they will stay here and continue to kind of wreak havoc in the lives of the people that they've left behind, instead of being able to provide them guidance and blessings as they should be able to do.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. And it's really resonant with a lot of other indigenous beliefs about the process that we have to go through at death in order to become ancestors. Like there's lots of crossing journey, right? Yeah. And so did the ancient Europeans, did they have, I mean, I know it's like conjecture, right? But in your research, were there practices, were they praying to their ancestors? Were they in relationship with their ancestors in a way that has become lost?
I wouldn't necessarily say that it has been lost, actually. We find practices like the adoption of souls in Fontanel Cemetery in Naples. These are called the anime pezzentelle. And these are the souls of people who have died and who are currently in purgatory, but who don't have living relatives who remain to pray for them. So most of the skulls and, the remains which are buried here are people who died during times of mass trauma, such as, the various plagues that have struck Southern Europe, or during war. And so the devotees, the people who go there, will adopt souls, and they will offer them what's called rinfresca, which translates as refreshment or cooling, which will sound very familiar to anybody who is involved in an African traditional religion or an Afro-diasporic tradition. But the devotees can offer this rinfresca in exchange for favors. And there's a mediumship aspect to it as well, where the soul might appear to a devotee in dream and start to reveal elements of their life, their gender, their job, whether they had children, whether they were married. And I bring this up because I think that it demonstrates some of the beliefs that there must be in place in order to support a cult like this. So we've already talked about there must be a way to an idea of an elevated ancestor, of a journey that we make after death, and the fact that once you've made that journey, you're in better shape to help your family who is still living. But here now we find the technology of helping souls over to the other side, and it comes in the form of rinfresque, of this refreshment, which may be, a white cloth, or it may be a candle, or it may be some kind of sacred artifact like a strand of rosary beads or a holy card or something to that effect.
It's super interesting. The way I came to working with ancestors was the approach of the untended dead of the AIDS epidemic, really making themselves known and saying, hey, like there are millions of us untended. And so I really resonate with this idea. I had no idea that there was this practice of the adoption of souls. It's beautiful.
Yeah, it's a type of magical charity in a way. It's work that we do as almost like social workers for the dead.
And are there any particular specificities around it? Like, how do you pick a soul, or how does a soul pick you, or anything around that? Or is it just kind of like pick one and work with it? Is it more specific to like names, or just say a little bit more if you would.
Well, this particular cult that I'm discussing right now is very much based out of Fontanel Cemetery in Naples. And Fontanel it's an ossuary. It's full of bones. Absolutely, just stacked from the floor to the ceiling, hundreds of thousands of people. And traditionally, a devotee would maybe either receive a dream from one of those souls who would tell them, or I should say her actually, because this was almost exclusively women's work for a very long time, would appear to her and say, here's where you'll find me. Here's exactly, where you will find my skull. And I want you to go to that skull and, to claim me as your own and to adopt me as your child. And so a lot of the language actually is about this kind of relationship between mother and child, where the devotee is the mother and the soul is actually the child. And actually it was believed that children, literal living children, made the best mediums. And so women would go into the crypt with their children and have them communicate, have the soul communicate through them if they were unable to achieve that contact through dreaming. And even the name Anima Pezzentella it's diminutive. It's cute. It's small. It's something, that calls to mind a child or some other precious thing or an old person who is in need of that nurturing. But once the soul had been adopted, the rewards that it would get for kind of helping out and helping to, put food on the table or bring money into the house or to protect the house would get gradually more extravagant. And so you might start with just, embroidered white cloth. And then place that over the skull, or even just a coin. But over time, souls which continue to, deepen their relationship with the devotee, they end up getting little houses built for them. And then the little house might be decorated with like rosaries or santini, which are the holy cards with like pictures of the saints or the Madonnas on them.
So interesting, the connection between these practices, like worshiping the bones is millennia, right? And then kind of the intersection with Christianity and the overlay of that. And I'm wondering, really what happened to ancestor worship in Christianity? And I do want to ask you about the communion of saints in particular, because I know that it's still there in some ways, right? Christians celebrate the resurrection of a dead guy, but really the kind of the earth-based ancestral reverence practices don't show up so much in modern Christianity. So if you talk to that a little bit, that'd be great.
Yeah. So with regard to where does ancestor worship go in Christianity, I think that there's two major events that we need to look at, which have impacted the degree to which ancestor reverence is accepted as a Christian practice. So the first is the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century, I want to say. And my husband is a historian, and he likes to say that the Protestant Reformation essentially told people the devil is still real, but all of the charms that you have to protect yourself from him don't work anymore. And
it really sucks.
I know, right? It's a really bad deal. And so, you no longer have the means to protect yourself and your family the same way that you used to before. The next major event that kind of shakes up the foundations of ancestor worship in Christianity is Vatican II in 1959. And so Vatican II was an attempt to reform certain aspects of the Catholic Church to sort of bring it into the modern era. So we get things like the Mass is now said in whatever the vernacular of the region is instead of Latin. So, that means that I can attend Mass in Italian or in English or Spanish instead of Latin at this point. But what a lot of the critics of Vatican II have pointed out is that it disowned a lot of the aspects of Catholicism that seem strange to a Protestant point of view. And so it was a kind of Protestantization of the Catholic Church, which involved kind of like not entirely disowning, but definitely the Madonnas and the saints and the dead were asked to take a back seat so that there could be more of a focus on, the theology of the resurrection. But nevertheless, I think it's important to point out that there are still practices of ancestor veneration within the Catholic Church, which are very normal and very common to people who are super into Catholicism. So it's still, completely normal to show up at the office of a church and ask them to pray a Mass on behalf of one of your ancestors. And, this isn't like a weird thing. They're not gonna ask for your Catholic credentials if you show up and do this. But it's a very powerful way to offer some elevation, some light and some progress, to your beloved dead. And then there's also a whole host of prayers that you can say on their behalf if for whatever reason you feel uncomfortable going to a church or you don't want to go that route. Prayers such as the Requiem, which we'll talk about later on, or the De Profundis, very traditional, very focused on, the imagery is very focused on the dead and on helping them to progress in their soul's journey. And then there are also a whole host of indulgences that can be devoted to your beloved dead that don't necessarily have that same kind of imagery. So things like even just going and saying the rosary with your family, that is indulgenced. There's a whole list of them. It was a lot longer before Vatican II, but now it's still there and it's still accessible to people. This is technology that if you came up in the Catholic Church at all, have access to. It's just that they've become less common and people aren't aware of them. They're not often taught as part of catechism or Catholic religious education anymore.
So what is the deal with the communion of the saints?
So officially, we're all saints. So officially, we have three churches. We have the Church Militant, which is, those of us who are still alive, the Church Penitent, which are the souls in purgatory, and then the Church Triumphant. And those are the people in heaven. And by the way, this is all official Catholic doctrine, and as I hope has become abundantly clear, this is not my personal doctrine, and I think you can all just take it or leave it. But I bring it up because we're all technically part of the communion of saints. And I think it's interesting because the cult of the saints was really an innovation. And it's something that Christianity brought about, which really shook up the local pagan and Jewish communities at the time. Peter Brown, in his fantastic Cult of the Saints, goes into this in great depth. And I have a couple of quotes from him on my blog. But it was a revolutionary thing at the time because of the fact that there was this contact with the bones, which had been really strongly forbidden by the pagan elite and also, by the Jewish community at the time. And when we look at the technology of sainthood as it is, officially recognized by the church today. Essentially what we're looking at are Mediterranean techniques for kind of stirring the dead, for inspiring them to action, maybe getting them a little bit agitated. So, officially it is easier to become a saint if you're martyred. And of course, martyrs, as people who die violently, were traditionally held to be people who were more likely to become revenants. We've also got practices like relics. So a relic is, a part of the body of the saint which is kind of taken out and exposed, and you have the ability to venerate it at certain points, that is to come in direct physical contact with it. And the disturbing of remains, of course, is another way that traditionally, people were believed to become revenants. But those two aspects, which are more about like kind of the stirring and the agitation of the saint, are balanced out by practices such as novenas, which were a novena is just a 9-day prayer, but it has its origins in Greek mourning rites. The number 9 was very much associated with the dead and with mourning for the dead. And so novenas are, in a way, kind of the opposite, the complement of this, where you are bringing that the therapy that the disturbed soul needs in order to continue to elevate. So it's this kind of weird technology of creating this cycle of stirring, but also refreshing and elevating the souls of the dead. My personal take on the saints, and this is getting a little bit away from official doctrine now, is that they're a type of ancestor who has sort of opted out of this cycle of birth and death and rebirth that we find ourselves in, and who has instead dedicated themselves to a different type of spiritual evolution, kind of aside from that cycle. And this is why, to me, they're a lot more interesting as kind of, guides, and as sources of wisdom and inspiration, because they, on the one hand, lived as humans, and so they understand what it means to be human and to have human passions and human suffering. But on the other hand, they have managed to evolve spiritually in a way that other humans don't necessarily get the opportunity to do.
That's a nice take. I like that. Yeah, I mean, it sounds like what you're talking about is attention, on how, like, it's interesting. The image that's coming is of a pot of soup and stirring the bones, right? Like, I am going to do these things to get your attention, but I also want to appease you. I don't want you to be upset or annoyed that I'm messing around with your bones, basically. But I do need your attention. Like, and it just brings up this idea of reciprocity, sacred reciprocity, between the dead and the living, that I just wanted to make note of.
I love that image, by the way. Bone broth. Okay. Oh, that's so good.
The ecstatic practices of Southern Europeans, I want to go towards that. Like, if you are of Southern European ancestry, what were the ecstatic practices, like maybe even before Christianity?
Well, I think it's interesting because, Southern European culture was so much about ecstasy, so much about ecstatic practices, and literally the word comes from the Greek ekstasis, for standing outside of oneself. So we find in Southern Italy, 2 particularly famous ancient cults of ecstasy. I'm thinking particularly of the cult of Cybele, who is she's the Phrygian mother goddess. And she's always addressed as mother, very similar to, the Madonna, who's referred informally as mamma. The name Cybele is actually a title. It's not her real name. And her cult was brought to Greece and then to Rome, where it was simultaneously immensely popular, but also very taboo, and very much frowned upon by, the elite, the scholarly elite. And then we've also got the cult of Dionysus, who is associated with wine and theater and madness and ecstasy and all of those wonderful things. But both of these cults were mystery cults, which meant, their rites were performed through a combination of, drugs and dancing and weird, chaotic music, and then being, exposed to sacred dramas or sacred objects while in that really ecstatic state. And they both also appealed primarily to people who were marginalized by Greek and Roman society. So they were popular among women, among slaves, among, people who were not full citizens, so they didn't have full rights. And what I think is really interesting about the culture of southern Italy is we actually find these two cults in a way still alive in some of the musical and dance traditions that we've inherited. So in Campania, which is the general province that Naples is in, we find a tradition called the Tamuriate, which is devoted to, they're called the Sette Sorelle. So that's the seven sisters. And the most important of the seven is the Madonna di Montevergine, who is associated with a ritual site. There's a church there now, but it was actually constructed in the 11th century specifically because there were still people doing pagan rites there. And so the logic of the church fathers was sort of like, monopoly style, let's build a building there and maybe we'll usurp the power. But the Tamuriate still has these elements that we found in the cult of Cibele, just kind of transformed into the Madonna di Montevergine. And a similar effect happens in Puglia, where we find the pizzica tarantata, which is actually a curative dance. So it's a dance therapy. And it was traditionally performed by women who were said to be bit by some kind of poisonous beast, so like a spider or a snake or a scorpion. And after experiencing that bite, often on like their thigh or some other, kind of sexual region, they would fall into either a deep melancholy or a state of mania. And they had to dance out the poison and receive the blessing of San Paolo in order to kind of cure themselves of this bite, which would otherwise be fatal. So you had to dance or you would die. And in this case, we find in the figure of San Paolo a transformed version of Dionysus. But the technology is still, it's ancient. It's I don't want to say the same because obviously we don't have video recordings of what people were doing in ancient Greece and Rome, but we do have frescoes and scenes that are painted on pottery that demonstrate these rites and show people playing the same instruments in the same style, dancing the same dance moves that you find when you go to, a celebration of the Madonna di Montevergine or, people dancing the pizzica tarantata today.
It's so interesting. I wrote down a couple of things that you said. You said cult of ecstasy and dance out the poison. And I always think about, kind of when I hear things in the past, like the cult of ecstasy, I'm like, oh man, I missed the cult of ecstasy, right? Like, I want to be in the cult. Who doesn't want to be in the cult of ecstasy? I think that these are things that we are still doing, right? Like, I'm thinking about, being with friends and hippie friends and dancing around a bonfire and, kind of, or even things like Burning Man or music festivals where there are drugs and dancing and community and transcendent, we're really trying to transcend what was it? What did you say it was? The stepping outside of the human form?
Stepping outside of yourself, yeah.
We're really trying to be in those spaces, to create those transcendent spaces where we can commune with the numinous, with what's bigger than us, with our ancestors, right?
And I mean, you can go to Montevergine on February 2nd of every year, and you can see the rites that are still being practiced as they've been practiced for several thousand years. Or you can just go and have a really good time with your friends, because ecstasy is the body's natural recourse. It just kind of happens, And it's not a guarantee by any means, the same way that like you can never guarantee that a party is going to happen. You can buy the food, you can make the playlist, you can set up the Facebook invite and invite all your friends, but you can't guarantee that the party is going to happen until the community shows up. And then there's this something that just kind of clicks between our bodies when we're sharing space with one another, when we're having a glass of wine, when we're listening to music, and it just kind of happens. We do this naturally. Our bodies were really designed for it.
And I'm hearing you say, like, you can't force it, check. And there are specific criteria that you can invoke, right, to make the conditions favorable. Like, you can have a party, but if you don't have good snacks or good music, right, like maybe it's going to take off. But there's things that you can do. So you're saying put your body in space with other bodies. So community. You're saying move together in specific ritualized movements. What was the other thing?
Food, wine, yeah, just, I think it just kind of happens, really. When we throw parties, and this is actually like a very spiritual thing for me and my husband, will actually put food out for the dead. We have an altar to our ancestors, and as people show up and they might bring something to share with the group, we always take a little tiny bite of that, and then we put it on a plate as an offering to the ancestors. So there is, the act of invocation for us and inviting them into this space to come alive again and to enjoy the party with us in a way, to be present and blessing our interactions with one another, that can be part of it as well.
That's that feeding. And again, I think for me, it's just important to make sure I'm clear who I'm feeding, right? But yeah, in my family, we have a practice every night of on our table, we light a candle, we pour water, and we put the first bites of food in a little dish for our well and bright ancestors. So that's like a daily feeding. And I think like that's what I'm hearing through the theme of this interview is that you're saying the attention that we give to them comes back towards us in goodness.
Yeah. And I think that as we're moving our bodies, they kind of get stirred up in the earth. And this is returning, I guess, to the theme earlier of, on the one hand, you want them to be cool and elevated and to have clear sight. But on the other hand, you also want them to be moved. You want them to be dancing. You don't want them to be, you want them to be peaceful, but you don't want them to rest too much.
Dances with ancestors. Talk a little bit about the weave of the erotic with what we were talking about, with movement and prayer and Italian folk magic and dancing and all that stuff. How does the erotic weave in?
So one of the dances that I referenced earlier, the tamburiate, is particularly known for its kind of raunchy lyrics. So it's never sung the same way twice. The traditional way is it's always improvised, which is interesting because it's the voice that kind of generates the song, and then it's up to the musicians to figure out how to play on the spot as they're reacting in real time to the improvisation of the singer. And then the dancers need to interpret the music. So it's like this sort of waterfall effect. But, the lyrics to it usually have just like sexual metaphor after sexual metaphor. One of the most famous lines is Bella fiola che ti chiamo rosa, which means, Bella fiola it means literally beautiful girl, but it's kind of like a euphemism for a prostitute. And che ti chiamo rosa means, your name is Rose, but Rose is also slang for vagina. And that's usually like where it starts, and then it kind of goes downhill from there, or uphill, depending on like what your perspective is. But it's just usually full of these kind of sexual metaphors, probably because it originates in rites of fertility, and because, this is a song which is sung still to this day by largely agricultural people. The south of Italy has not industrialized to the same degree that the north has, who care about the fertility of the earth and who care about, their own fertility and their ability to, bear children.
It makes me so happy that the passage you chose to translate is an invocation to sacred sex workers. That is delightful. Yeah, beautiful. Thank you. That feels really good. Yeah, I think I'm ready for some prayer if you're feeling ready for it.
Okay, absolutely. So I chose this prayer because it is a short one and one which has served me so well. And I wanted to teach it to your listeners in Latin, because this is the language that our Catholic ancestors would have learned their prayers in and heard the Mass in until Vatican II. So until, the mid-20th century. And what I like about praying in Latin as a kind of devotional practice is it unites us with the church throughout time and space. And it kind of like bridges that gap between us and our Catholic ancestors, because they know these words too, regardless of where they lived, whether they were in, Ireland or France or Italy, they would have learned these words as children. So this is the prayer. It is called the Requiem. And I'm just going to say it slowly one time, and then I'll say it at more of a normal pace. Requiem aeternam dona eis Domine, et lux perpetua luceat eis. Requiescant in pace. Amen. So, a little bit faster. Requiem aeternam dona eis Domine, et lux perpetua luceat eis. Requiescant in pace. Amen. And what that means is, eternal rest grant unto them, O Lord, and let perpetual light shine upon them. May they rest in peace. Amen. So you can really pray this every day if you want to. Because of the reference to light shining upon the dead, it's particularly appropriate to speak it as you're lighting a candle. So you might be lighting a candle in church, one of the offertory candles, or you can just get a candle in your own home and maybe put it on an ancestor altar and say that little prayer. It's also useful if you come across like a grave marker unexpectedly. One of the, the groups of the dead that I'm particularly moved by is people who have passed due to passed at crossroads. So we find in the U.S. this practice of like ghost bikes where, when somebody has died riding their bike, there will be like a bike that is painted all white, and then sometimes, it will have garlands or stuff. So when I pass sites like that where I know something has happened, I'll, cross myself and say this prayer for whoever it is, guarding that crossroads now and hoping for the safety of the people who are walking through it today.
Yeah, actually, I have a friend in LA who's part of that Ghost Bike project. So thank you for the prayer. I've just closed my eyes and I listened to it as you were reciting it and just let it land on my body. Really, there's a sweetness there to it. Thank you. Mallorie, I want to ask you, I know you have an upcoming online course called Ancestor Veneration from the Ground Up. And just wanted to ask you to invite folks to it, talk a little bit about what would happen, what the content is, and how folks can sign up.
So this is a 4-part course covering a lot of the topics that we've touched on lightly today, but in greater depth. I wanted to put it together as a way to contextualize some of the beliefs that I talk about a lot through my blog, traditional Southern Italian and Sicilian beliefs about the nature of the dead and about our relationship with them and how we can engage with them through, ritual and mediumship. And to take that and to put it into more of a practitioner context. So whereas with the blog, I try to keep it for the most part focused on material that is maybe ethnographic in nature. There's a lot of footage that I include on the blog from these different feasts that are happening in Italy still to this day. A lot of recordings of music. I'm trying with the course to make that a little bit more accessible to people and to show them how they can take that thing which maybe seems really distant right now and to make it close and to make it relevant and to put it into practice in their own lives. So while the focus is going to be primarily on Southern Italian and Sicilian folk magic and folk Catholicism, I feel like anybody can really benefit from it, and certainly like I'm overjoyed to take on students from various different parts of the world. And I think that anybody who has Catholic ancestry but who maybe has like some hesitance around engaging with that because of the fact that often people associate Catholicism with sexual shame, sexual trauma, and, you know, generally a bad time, might enjoy this as a way to kind of shake some of that off and to see, you know, a vibrant culture of folk Catholicism, which is more grounded in love for the earth, sensuality, the worship of the Great Mother, the Madonna, and the veneration of the dead.
I love it that you are bringing ancestor worship back to Catholicism. I mean, in a really grounded, present way. How awesome. I'm just delighted to hear that. That's fantastic. Thank you for doing that.
Thank you so much for having me.
I just want to encourage folks to check that out. Check out that offering on your website, as well as other wonderful pieces of writing and information that Mallorie offers. And again, her website is www.italianfolkmagic.com, and you can read more about ancestry veneration from the ground up. And yeah, Mallorie, thank you so much. It's been such an honor and privilege to get to check in with you about some of this stuff. I really appreciate your time.
Likewise, thank you.
And just wanting to thank everyone for listening to this episode. I am Pavini Moray, and this is Bespoken Bones. And we will be back every new and full moon with more embodied goodness and ancestral wisdom.